Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's special webcast focused on the Global Leadership Forecast, how top organizations are growing strong with women in leadership. I'm Amy Abel. I'm the Managing Director here at the Conference Board, and I'm delighted that you've chosen to join me and my guests for this special webcast. Before I dig into the topic of today, I wanted to just highlight some administration. If you are viewing this webcast and would like some credits, HRCI, SHRM, and CPE, please follow the instructions, type in your name in the box provided, and click on the pop-ups when they appear. So thanks very much for doing that. And without further ado, let me introduce my guest, Susan Robinson, who's Principal for People Advisory Services for Ernst & Young. Susan, thank you for joining me, and I know that you are traveling and in Europe today, so very, very grateful to have you join me in this conversation.
Oh, thank you, Amy. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Terrific. So we are digging into really frankly, a difficult topic of conversation, women leadership and how organizations continue to build and be stronger because of women leadership. But those of us that are in this space, we know that this has been a challenge for many of us in organizations and in the diversity inclusion area that we may work with and partner with. Many of us may say it remains a challenge. So this is a new research study that we wanted to share with you. It was a partnership from DDI, EY, and the Conference Board called the Global Leadership Forecast of 2018. And you can see on the slide that we had it's the largest leadership survey of its kind in the world, and we've been doing it for a few years now with our partners. There are over 2,400 companies represented, over 25,000 leaders in this survey sample, and HR professionals across functions, industries, geography. So it's a big survey with a lot of data, and because of that, this is just another graphical representation of all the all the individuals we had in the survey. But because of the breadth and depth of this data, you can see that we covered lots of different topic areas, which is why we put together this webcast series. So I hope all of you are participating, and this is not the first one you've joined us. We're doing 12 webcasts every month, once a month, from this past summer to the next summer or this coming summer around different topics like digital and data. What does that mean for your leaders? Or leaders at the core, how do they learn? Are they ready? What does your pipeline look like? Cultural drivers, what's driving all the different aspects of leaders in your organization? And finally, of course, what HR opportunity, what can we do as HR leaders, executives, professionals, consultants to help this change and transformation around how we take on leadership challenges? How do we help the companies that we work with to take on this role? And for today, specifically on this webcast with Susan, we'll take on leadership diversity as a topic. Lots of issues and challenges going on, and this research dug into different aspects of leader, and we will probe into that a little bit, but a highlight of it is women leadership and what's going on in the world today. This was a global study. So let me first, by turning it over to Susan, and again, thank you again, Susan, for joining us. Tell us what's going on in the world and the current landscape around women leadership and organizations, from your own view as well as, of course, from the work that you do.
Yeah, so I would say this is a topic that's been, along with other aspects of D&I, that's been in the market for years. I'll loosely say 20 plus years. It could even be longer in some cases. And, my personal view on it is that it's pathetic. How is it that we're still here given all the investments that's been happening in the world? A lot of smart people, some good progress in places, but one of the data points that we've seen from, I think it's a 2014 study from World Economic Forum. They did a global gender gap report, and many of you have probably heard about this, but basically they said it's going to take until 2095 to achieve global gender equity in the workplace. And then on top of that, another 80 years before there's equality in leadership roles between men and women. Well, that's kind of crazy, if I put it very simply. What's that about? And what we find so fascinating about some of that data is there is some really good work that's happening in the marketplace trying to address these concerns and these issues. And so there's investment being made. People are trying to keep it at the top of their priority list and so on, particularly gender. And so what we want to try to share with you today is what's different now, and what are we starting to see in regards to progressive thinking and progressive actions that may help propel some of those numbers and those results forward a little faster and a little more sustainably. So we'll look forward to diving into some of that on this call.
And thanks, Susan, for sort of taking on that challenge and putting it out bluntly, the struggles that we have had around this topic of, supporting women leadership and promoting women leadership. I appreciate that frankness from you, so thank you for that. And to the audience, I wanted to invite you into this conversation. You can ask questions by typing in your questions in the lower left-hand box. So please join us throughout the webcast. We will see your questions, and Susan and I will sort of take those on and engage you in this dialogue. So please do join us. Back to you, Susan.
So let's go to our next slide, and that'll give you a bit of a snapshot of what are some of the data points on where are we today. So I shared with you some of the data from the Global Gender Gap Report from the World Economic Forum, but there are multiple sources of information that really validate that, look, while there has been some real effort or attention on this topic, particularly around gender representation, the needle isn't moving as quickly or as substantially as one might think it would given that effort. And the landscape still has so much room to shift. And so what we get interested in regards to that is, what's that about? But also, it's not just looking at the C-suite and the board levels, although those are two very significant areas where a great deal of power is held in the organization. So representation there is key. But it's also looking throughout the organization and how are we even looking at representation from a gender perspective at junior levels or at mid-management levels. And that's crucial because of pipeline management. So we can dive a little deeper into some of that and perhaps spend a bit of time talking about what's different today and what are some of those disruptors.
Cool.
Why don't I take you to our next slide and we can talk a little bit about what that looks like. So here's, and a lot of you may have already seen variations of this, and this is certainly not an exclusive list. But when we think about, so what's different today, I think there's a few things that validate that. So you can see in the boxes on the screen, the generational shift is still alive and well. So of course, in our workforce today, there's the 4 generations that are represented. And you can argue that there's always some form of that, throughout the various generations. So I'll come back to that in a second. But as you move across the page, you can see, look, the definition of employees are changing. Workforces are thinking differently about how do they access talent, how do they leverage talent, how do they pay for talent. So that this is where the gig economy is also really interesting, and robotics. And then there's a whole other thing around high-performing teams and innovation. I think some form of this has always been around, but it's almost as though our collective consciousness, not just in corporations, but even in society, is shifting and changing. And that's having an impact into how leaders are looking at and considering, the big topic of D&I and gender representation. The next one kind of gets into purpose-driven and socially conscious constructs, and that is equally important. We're seeing a lot of organizations pay a lot more attention to not just the typical sort of vision and mandate, but how is it meaningful? Where is the purpose in it? And a lot of that is driven by the fight for the consumer market. But nonetheless, it's great. It's very well intended, and I think the results and the sidelines of it are really powerful. But it's the red box I want to hover on for a second, and that's the technology impact. So if you look at all these different boxes, particularly when you think about the different generations, so I'll pick on the millennials as an example. I think they're an incredible impact on the workforce today. Our firm is made up, I think, of about over 70% of our workforce are millennials. So we have the pleasure of, working with that generation a lot. And I think every new generation, youth kind of brings in something fresh and new and disruptive to an organization. But what seems to be different about millennials in particular is technology, right? So think about access to information, digital, information, whether it's in an organization, outside of an organization, political, social, what have you. It can flow around and in amongst your staff and your workforce and your leaders and your consumers in a way that we've never really experienced before. And these millennials represent a generation that's kind of grown up with it. So, the Gen Zs are going to have an even larger impact. All of this, these types of disruptions, I think are changing the game up. And the other piece that kind of wraps through this that I think is very powerful is just the social consciousness. So whether it's driven politically, regardless of what side of the fence you might fall on, regardless of where you live, you can't deny that there's something shifting and changing. And our kind of collective awakening, if I could go there, is having an impact. And all of that is laddering into our awareness of, oh, wow, how are women being treated? Oh, I don't know if I have the right sort of representation. And, our theme today is on gender, but you could apply all of this to other aspects of diversity and inclusiveness, whether it's people of color or whether it's into LGBTQ, into diverse abilities, what have you. There's, all these things are starting to have a greater level of awareness, and we're seeing that C-suites and board members are really trying to pay attention to what's that impact on my organization from a talent perspective, a leadership development perspective, and even an innovation and a consumer impact.
And Susan, if I could jump in, I really love the way you frame that around the collective awakening, right? There's enough disruptive forces that you summarize so eloquently around why it's different today and how it's pushing it. And I agree with you, the millennial population is a key aspect, around the purpose-driven and socially driven idea for organizations. There's no question that is a millennial-driven force in our businesses today. It just wasn't as much in the past, and it is, broadly speaking, today. And it's, of course, technology. Technology continues to evolve, but collectively it forms this shift, as you said, right? And it's a shift that perhaps could make that change in some of these really challenging issues around women's leadership and what does that mean to us. I wondered if you thought that collective awakening, is it happening? I'm maybe perhaps being a little bit too philosophical in my thinking now. Is it just sort of a evolutionary shift going on, or has it been just more intentional by the thinking of this population and this group? Realizing that that's perhaps a little bit of a theoretical question. I wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, we all need to take a sip of our wine collectively, everyone on the webcast as we're talking through this stuff. But, I think it's a bit of both. So for sure, I think there are some esoteric components to this, but what we're starting to see our clients look at, and we spend a fair bit of our time kind of in working with our clients, understanding this better, is so what impact is that having on my organization, on my overall financial performance, on the health and the functionality of my teams? Can I attract talent that I want to get, and can I keep them? What are my leaders looking like? And a lot of this, there's, in parallel with all this, there's some really wonderful research being done. Our firm's doing it, but a lot of other firms are doing it. And I think it's great. There's a lot of space for some thoughtware here. But really starting to show how, a more diverse organization and an inclusive organization, I'm going to come back to that in a second because culture plays a very big role here. There is a lot of evidence that shows there's a direct correlation on overall financial performance of an organization. And it's not just financial performance, and that's a big lever for sure, but it also gets into high-performing teams and a more innovative collaborative culture. And, all these words are kind of sound bites that we all use these days when we're trying to be good leaders or good managers or work for good leaders or good managers. But it matters, people are really seeing that, if I'm going to stay working at a place, if I'm going to be at my best, boy, it's going to go a long way if I really enjoy working there, and I feel respected. And we'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing on our end to try to enable that. But it all stems back to, the C-suite in particular, because again, this is where decisions are being made around some of these things that will ultimately shift the landscape in a sustainable manner. Again, all areas, but let's focus on gender for the sake of this discussion. This is where we're seeing organizations be much more deliberate in their planning and their strategies around, how do we get more women in these key leadership roles or sitting on boards, or how do we enrich our pipeline? So it's really fascinating and it's wonderful to see. And the optimist in me feels like, look, I'm so grateful to have had trails blazed for me, but I'm very conscious, in my career, when I look at the juniors that I have the opportunity to work with, they're just, ridiculously amazing, both the men and the women. But if I look at, again, just for the sake of this call, into these young women, it's my accountability. I feel so committed to doing what I can to help those young women, kind of step through some of the things that I couldn't step through. Now, again, it's, these things kind of evolve over time, but I do think that, representation plays a million roles, and one of them is you're more thoughtful of the group you represent. And it doesn't mean that, so let's pick on, white men for a second, and I'm sorry, any white men that's on the call, you are a catalyst, is what I personally think about that group. But, that is a really powerful group of stakeholders that truly can leverage their positions and their privilege to make some of those changes. And I also think that level of awareness is shifting and changing for a myriad of reasons, some of which we've talked about. But, there's, I feel like there's a lot of reason to feel optimistic.
So, Susan, I have a question, and also let me re-invite the audience. If you have a question, to type in to the lower left-hand box, and we'll certainly try to address that. But my question is, in these conversations that you have in the boardrooms and different groups of leaders around, and first, it's great to hear that so many conversations that they want to be more intentional, they're wanting to be more thoughtful, and having that conversation around promoting and developing more women leaders. But where do they struggle? What do they say to you when they're like, we can't do it because of X, Y, and Z? What are they articulating as their pain points as to why they are not as effective as they would like to be?
That's a great question. And so I'll give a couple of illustrations, and again, certainly not exhaustive, because I think there's a lot of variation in what organizations are experiencing. But let's take a slice of it around sector, right? So I hear some people say, oh, if I'm in life sciences, then there's probably a good mix of gender representation that I can tap into. And if you do look at life sciences, some of the clients we have the pleasure of working with, they're amazing, in regards to the leadership representation. And it's a really wonderful feeling to work with them, because you see where it works, right? Where that balanced representation of leadership and teams is pretty powerful. But let me take a traditional male-dominated sector, whether it's power and utilities or you can think of some others. But I point that one out in particular because on International Women's Day, one of our partners, one of my colleagues, released a report with a firm that looked at power and utilities in particular and some of the gender trends that are happening there. So again, this is a generalization, but typically you would look at a sector like that and think highly male dominated, where am I going to find these women, And that myth is starting to really, evaporate, because the women are out there. And I mean, whether it's that sector or anything else, that excuse to me kind of brings along an eye roll. I feel pretty strongly about it, like the women are out there, give me a break. Like, let's think about, you have to have deliberate talent strategies. It's not just, it doesn't just happen through magic. There are strategies and there are thoughtful plans that have to make sure this works. But let's, again, back to power and utilities. this is a sector that is changing and shifting, very much disrupted by the renewable energy changes that are happening. Digital's having an impact there, like it is in many other, if not all, sectors. And then consumer expectations also are a big shift. So we haven't talked a great deal about that, but that's another thing that's driving how people are thinking differently around some of this stuff. So I think that's a really wonderful story and a great sector to watch. That again, these traditionally male-dominated worlds where one might have made a huge assumption that you can't find the women. I think there's some really innovative things happening in some of those sectors, and I give all credit to the leaders who are making some of that happen. You're not going to change all this overnight, so I think it's that long strategy you want to take a look at, and it's multivariated, right? So it's the talent, it's the internal look, but it's also that external look into the marketplace.
And Susan, you mentioned the energy sector. I actually specifically remember reading an article recently where there are more women CEOs in that sector than you would believe. And that has been shifting very dramatically over the last number of years to all the points that you just made. So yeah, thank you for refreshing my memory on that. I remember thinking exactly what you just said. I was quite surprised. But there are inroads being made and trails being blazed, and we just need to continue to do that around that sector and other sectors. And like you said, take away sort of the premise of, oh, we just can't find people or the skills or the capabilities, etc. Yeah. Yeah.
You got it.
So
Absolutely.
let's shift a little bit and talk about the work that you continue to do either within eWire or certainly within other organizations around how are organizations tackling this? What are some different ways of thinking around women's leadership and practices that they're doing in the organization? What's going on in that area?
Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. And this is a bit of a heavy slide, but it'll give you a snapshot into some of the things that we're seeing in the market and, what are some of the practices that we're seeing that are actually helping enable this shift to happen. And so, I mean, there's a lot you can digest in this Venn diagram, but bottom line is this is not just isolated to a senior leadership level need. This is something that permeates throughout the entire organization, and so it's important for organizations to think about it in that way, right? And a lot do, right? It's not rocket science in that sense, but the point being that if you're just starting to look at your pipeline when you get to critical promotion level timeframes, well, you're probably not going to be in great shape. You got to really make sure you're caring and feeding for that pipeline. And so, that's kind of the whole life cycle. And again, our topic is gender here, but I would certainly encourage as you listen, think about other groups that really need more representation in our workforces, and how this could apply to them, because I think there's a lot of parallels. But a couple things I would punch out here. There is a lot of really encouraging awareness happening at the C-suite and the board level. So you see a lot of this happening in the news, and you're probably seeing it in your organizations. Board representation is, trying to balance that out and putting some real deliberate focus on that is really important. Some organizations are embracing that more than others. Some states have some regulatory requirements that are coming in to make that happen. A lot of mixed views on that stuff. Some people don't want it to be a regulatory effort. Others feel like that's the only way it's going to happen. I feel like, look, whatever it takes to get there in an equitable way is good. The landscape has not shifted dramatically from all the good effort that's happened all these years. So clearly, we need to be doing something a little more aggressive and more deliberate. I also think HR has a very significant role to play here. The talent strategies, the real deliberate approach to talent strategies and succession planning, recruitment, development, all exposure opportunities, all those things are still really important. And a lot of that infrastructure is pretty strong in organizations. I just think sometimes you don't always see the same dots being able to be connected into the D&I strategies. And a lot of that is, and so again, this is a broad generalization I'll make. So as you're listening to this, if you disagree, please, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but hopefully it's somewhat, validating. D&I has been treated in general terms, all my disclaimers, as almost a compliance exercise, right? It's a quota-driven exercise. I need X number of women in this role by, X date. Same goes for minorities and, other representative groups. Look, that's still important. I think that's not going to go away entirely. I think it's being rebranded, if I could call it that. But it's not just representation, it's also inclusivity. And this is where culture is the game changer, in my view. I think historically we understand culture, of course, we all get it. We live and work and breathe in these organizations. So we know what culture is because it's our experience there. But I think traditionally there's been a passive approach to it taken by a lot of organizations. And I really think it's that list of disruptors, it's that combination of them that's changing the game in terms of how organizations are looking at culture today. How do I really leverage it and measure it? And how does D&I fit into it? And so some of the clients we have an opportunity to work with are doing some really interesting work and trying to be almost strategically thoughtful about D&I in ways we haven't seen before. So this might be a little outside the norm for some organizations, but what is kind of fun to see in some that we have a chance to work with is D&I being looked at almost as importantly and as strategically as your operational or your financial performance. So that speaks to metrics, and there's a lot of work to be done still in the metric space on all this stuff. But all those elements kind of ladder up into how organizations are run. And if people are paying kind of the parallel sort of focus on representation and inclusivity, that's where you're starting to see not just a renewed effort on the topic, but it's a little more sustainable. It's starting, I pray and I hope that it sticks and it really moves our, corporate world forward meaningfully. But, it's kind of a combination of our own organizational maturity, as a business world in North America, and Europe as well, other places, Asia too, Middle East. There's a lot of interesting things happening. But I do think the societal impact is having a big deal too. So I'll just mention Me Too very briefly. That is a significant event that has really shaken things up. I think, there's varying views on it. And one is, it's important that these things come out and it's important that this behavior stops. I mean, table stakes. But I think it's also very important that organizations, that doesn't become something that tips us into D&I almost as a crisis management activity. I don't think that's going to help anybody. This is going to be a world of resentment and fear and more barriers going up between the genders. So, while it's kind of wonderful and fascinating to see that our tolerance for certain behavior is done and there are consequences, I think organizations would do very well by trying to be more proactive. I'll put it that way in this space. And look, there's a lot of stuff organizations have to clean up. And they are, I think a lot of them are doing their best. Again, HR has a huge role to play in data and analytics and understanding where some of these hotspots are. But if I pull us back up to culture again, all these things ladder up into it. And if you can really get a good handle on your culture, where you want to go, how you want your organization to feel to your workforce, and how that extends out into your consumer, this is where, again, that strategic rationale for why greater representation, whether it's gender or other buckets, is almost a business imperative. And that's really exciting. So that's more kind of thoughtware perspective. But I can certainly move us into what are some pragmatic things that we've been doing in our
Susan,
own firm.
Before you jump into there, because it's a great story, but we have a bunch of comments and questions coming in. So if I could pause you for a second, my own reflective point based on, well, you just said a number of different really interesting things, but I have not thought of D&I as a crisis management effort. So to me, that's a really startling and alarming thought that I think I need to just reflect on personally in a private room. But what a what would that would be such a not a great direction to head into. So I've never actually connected those premises. But thank you for sort of pushing my thinking on that. But a couple of the comments that I just wanted to read to you. It seems that many. One of our viewers noted, totally agree. We are working at measuring inclusion by measuring the extent to which employees are willing to speak up and employee perception on manager support for D&I. Mm-hmm. This has put focus on the culture and inclusivity, not just in the workforce mix. So what a great, interesting practice. Thank you for sharing that. Fabulous. Yeah, fabulous. And another comment was, it seems that many organizations have been paying attention to how culture is developing in how people think and make decisions. Is there any work being done regarding how to channel culture sculpting into a broader promotion of D&I? So I guess the conversation or the question is around how to insert D&I into the shaping of this culture. And you've started to hint about that. I wondered if you could expand some of your thinking.
Yeah, so first of all, I love that we have an audience here that know this space and have a role to play, I'm assuming, in this space. I hope you feel so empowered in your roles, because I think what you're going to find is it's going to get more and more strategic and a differentiator in regards to your overall company's performance. So I love that, and that comment was amazing. To the question, actually, I'm in Vienna this week, so life is not so hard, but part of the reason I'm here is because I'm working with our global culture team. So EY is investing heavily into just our own understanding and how we support our clients in that culture space. And one of the hats that I get to wear is D&I. So I'm going to give a lot of credit to our own internal D&I commitment. And Karen Twarnite, who is our Chief Diversity Officer, has just done remarkable work in our firm. And we're Big Four consulting. We're as complex as they get, and we're global. We've got just under 300,000 employees, so it's just a lot of stuff to figure out when it comes to our own culture. And I think we've done some really interesting things internally, and we're not perfect. We still have a ways to go ourselves in terms of having greater representation and cultivating our own culture. But that is the work that I've been able to get closer to and think about, okay, how do we take that to our clients? So I appreciate the credibility of it, because we've lived it, we are living it, we continue to live it. But I'm really energized by the understanding this topic of D&I better, all the good and bad and ugly of what we have or haven't achieved over the years. And there's really good things on both sides of that coin. But how do we pull that into a relevant discussion with the C-suite? And the reason I isolate it there is because that's where the decision making is made. That's where the power resides in the organization, and they shift and shape the strategies and the priorities and the imperatives and all this stuff. So what we're trying to do with our clients and what we're exploring ourselves is, how do you change the game in regards to D&I? And I think an obvious way in there is culture. And part of culture, again, because culture is this big, broad, esoteric topic, how do you make that pragmatic and measurable? So I won't ramble too long about that, but metrics is the key here. And there's a lot of work to really understand what are the right metrics. I think there are some universal ones, but I also think they are specific to organizations, because organizations are in varying places of maturity. So that's kind of a space that we're really enjoying, rolling our sleeves up and learning ourselves. But I will say confidently, there's absolutely a way to pull D&I into organizational culture and tying it to a more stronger dashboard when it comes to C-suite metrics.
And Susan, I know that on the next slide, we're going to jump into some of the details of how you guys are doing it. It's a great story. And before we do that, can I ask one last question from the audience? How much does the baby boomer bubble, if you will, the population changes obviously, impact the ability to promote women into leadership roles? How can companies demonstrate their willingness to promote women at the highest levels when those limited seats are currently occupied by a generation who are continuing to work past traditional retirement age? And I'll toss that to you in a second. We do know at the Conference Board, we do quite a bit of work on labor markets and sort of demographic changes. And there is certainly an element of baby boomers not retiring or working longer, to the audience's question. We also know that in the next 10, 15 years, all baby boomers will be retiring. It's a life fact thing. And so interesting to see how that will evolve over the next 10, 15 years. So what are your thoughts, Susan?
Yeah, it's a great question and great response, Amy. I'm so with you on all that stuff. I think, look, this stuff is still a bit of a marathon. You're not going to change your whole landscape overnight. This is the blessing and the curse of, I think, the challenge ahead of us. But I do think that I think organizations are looking at it differently. And that will enable us as we look at workforce planning, talent management, succession planning, what have you. It's still time now to look at that so we can be more thoughtful and prepared in our pipeline and our culture of our organizations as some of those boomers and the demographics shift. The other point that I kind of think a lot about, and I've worked with some clients who are having such open, vulnerable conversations around this stuff is, let's isolate it on those boomers, and I'm going to isolate further into the white male boomers who may still hold the majority of those powerful positions. Look, it's a mixed bag, right? And some of you may be living this, directly yourselves, but the reality is, if they still hold a lot of those roles, what do you do with that? And so we're trying to have the discussion with clients around, I want to change the dialogue from it being a threat or, women being a threat. I'm going to take these roles, these white guys can't find a job or they're going to be threatened by their job. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious around that, and I apologize. I don't mean that to be offensive because I know that is real for some. But my tone is probably enhanced by, they're fine. They have these roles, they're going to be okay. The world is so set up and enabling and giving them such privilege. And that's where I think the game and the dialogue needs to change and talk about privilege. How do we leverage privilege so that you can open some of these doors and help with some of that readiness? And the same is true for men and women. So I'll go a bit further to say, white men and women have an equal responsibility to use that privilege for minority groups. And you can apply that to all different aspects of, what defines a diverse workforce. But I think we want to be careful we don't go down a threatening path, and you can rather have the courage to have the discussion around privilege. How can we leverage these boomers? We're talking about this group, to be catalysts. And look, they're not all going to do it, right? We're not all going to get it. We're not all going to get it. But those that might and those that do is powerful. Some of my greatest mentors and sponsors have been men. And, I appreciate them and they give me great guidance and so on. I love my female mentors and sponsors as well. But I think that's where organizations have the opportunity to shift and pull that dilemma, if I could call it that, into a more kind of positive and optimistic dialogue.
And if I can build on that, Susan, there is research out there that shows absolutely to support women leaders, there is high effectiveness to having a male sponsorship. To continue to support them in their experiences. There's definitely research around that. It is an effective strategy for many. So let me direct you, and we really want to hear the EY story as well. And a question came in, so your choice if you want to answer the question first, or maybe it sort of flows into the rest of the EY story, which is, could you please expand on the universal metrics that you mentioned? What can you expand on that? What does that mean, or what are organizations doing around that?
Yeah. So I'll talk about metrics and then maybe we can hop to the next slide and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things we're doing with gender in particular. So metrics is a tough nut to crack. I think we're still figuring it out in many ways. So I would say, again, in broad generalizations, the D&I metrics landscape is still pretty traditional. And so traditional would mean, I'll say quota based. That's like a bad word in that context. Not many people like talking about it, and that's okay. I understand that, but I do think that representation targets, some sort of talent targets, workforce targets, they're still important. Until we get greater equity, I think that we still need to have deliberate strategies. So those metrics will still be important. What I'm seeing some clients do, and we've just had an opportunity to work with a client of ours in this space, is rather than just think about D&I in traditional ways, kind of come up out of that and think about the organization as a whole. So what is the strategic imperatives of this organization? What are we trying to achieve? Who do we serve? What do we need from our workforce? And how do we measure some of those things? And then as we understand that, lay D&I on top of that, right? So, and it helps us to think of D&I in a more comprehensive way. So it's, workforce and talent are huge parts of that, but it could also be around your vendor strategy, right? That's another big common topic that we see a lot of organizations being a lot more thoughtful around. I think also the consumer strategy, the customer strategies are some elements that help shape the D&I dashboard. So, there may be some sector-specific things to look at as well. And so, for example, we had a client in healthcare who looked at the patient makeup, and the representation of the patients would also have some correlation to their workforce. It's fascinating. So without getting too detailed and specific into a specific sector, I would say regardless of which sector you're in, be thoughtful around the overall organization. What is it we're trying to achieve? What are our goals? And then, how is our workforce strategy lining up with that? Where does D&I cut through it? And that's where you can have a more thoughtful discussion around metrics. The last thing I'll say on that, which I think will be substantially game changers, and some organizations are already looking at it. We're spending a lot of time ourselves in the space when we think about culture, is how do we find the right metrics or metric? Maybe there is one magic silver bullet for a company that can show that correlation to their overall financial performance. So, there are ways, there's data that you can leverage that, can help with algorithms, but you want it to be meaningful, right? So I always think if I can have this discussion with the CFO and it be credible and meaningful and measurable, then that's good. And some of it, at this time, I still think it's very client specific because every organization may feel unique. And they are, but I think as we get more headway in this space, it'll be interesting to see if there are some, silver bullets that might be applicable to all organizations. So that's a bit of a garbled reply, and I apologize for that. But I do think the answer here is think non-traditionally, think holistically and comprehensively about the business and the workforce, and then what do you need with D&I? And think about your culture. How do you measure it? Have you measured it? Do you know what your culture goals are? And how do you plug D&I into that?
I think that's an awesome response. I think that's terrific. So, okay, let's shift over to the next slide, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just pull us back one, please. There we go. So this is a very simplistic view, but again, we don't need to overcomplicate the topic. But when we think about gender in particular, and again, I would say this is applicable to other areas, other representative groups, but we think of these three things: sponsorship, belonging, and the right sort of assignments and experiences. So on the sponsorship side of that coin, mentoring has been something that has really kicked up nicely in a lot of organizations, and I'm sure many of you have your mentors. You may be mentoring yourself. That's really important. That's not going away anywhere. What's different with sponsorship is this is more around advocacy, right? So this is someone who's kind of tucking you under their wing, being thoughtful of your career progression. How are you getting the right exposure? Weaving you into the right discussions and dialogue. So it's very personalized, and it can extend into obviously professional, but it can even bring in some personal aspects to it. Family, um, religion could be part of it. We see that in places, values and beliefs. But this is something that we're seeing to be, really powerful and really interesting. And some of the things that we've learned as we've been doing this is keep your sponsorship diverse. So it's really easy for me to go and sponsor someone who kind of feels and looks like me and, has a similar sort of career path and background, gender, what have you. But if we've learned that our sponsorship efforts are more powerful when that's more thoughtful and diverse itself. So it's one, be mindful of that is what I would say in regards to sponsorship. And it's not just about talent management behind the scenes. I mentioned earlier around, get some exposure, pull people into some high-profile meetings, work them into some dialogues, take some risks, pull people in, give them exposure to, some of the more senior leaders, what have you. Those are some elements that have been learnings for us in the sponsorship space. Let me take you a little further into belonging. So I'm really proud of our belonging campaign. So we actually refer to our D&I efforts internally under the banner of belonging. And we're going to share a video with you today that represents one of the internal campaigns that we've had that kind of speaks to, what that means for us. And one of the things that I've always loved about this firm is how I just can be myself here. And there's something very powerful about that. So the sense of feeling included, that you belong, you don't have to conform, you can actually be authentic, and that to be valued in an organization and to be successful is very, very powerful. I think we have yet to really tap into that as a corporate culture, and I'm speaking broadly beyond EY, but that's something we're finding is really, really powerful. And I love even the word belonging, right? There's something that connotates, and we're finding that, what ways do people not feel? If you think of it the opposite, what are the adverse effects of not feeling like you belong? Well, you're excluded, you don't feel like you're being trusted or respected, and there's some level of social exclusion, and that starts to make people feel ignored or sad or stressed, and all of this ladders up into you're not showing up as your best self, and that's going to have direct impacts on productivity, right? So again, I get none of these companies are running country clubs, right? You're still coming to work to do a job and to produce and all those good things. But I love that organizations are understanding that the best you can get out of your workforce is making them feel the best, allowing them to feel the best they can. And that's where I think belonging and culture is just so powerful. And then I'll touch on the last one, I'll pause. So then experiences and assignments, this is very deliberate, right? So be mindful of not just where people's jobs are and the tasks they have to do, but really being thoughtful around, are there special projects that really help someone blossom? The development is very thoughtful around exposure and stretching the skill sets into an area or a space that they may need some development in. But it's done in a safe sort of construct so that development isn't a stressful experience. So again, in our world, a lot of it is engagement driven. So we have great opportunity to make this happen on engagements and internal projects, what have you. But I would argue in any organization, this is also very applicable. So that thoughtfulness, that authentic approach to how we have our staff and our resources and our talent spend their time and deploy their talents. There's some magic to that. Look, again, we are not perfect. We have so many things to learn and grow and develop through ourselves. But these three pillars, as simple as they may be, are really powerful. I can speak to it personally. It's certainly had a huge impact on my own kind of commitment and and enthusiasm for what I get to do.
And Susan, what I like about your story, the EY story, and how you're using these three pillars. I mean, the concept of sponsorship obviously is not a new thing, and many of us may have worked with this concept in the past or in different organizations. But I hear the intention, very thoughtful intention, and the collective of the three pillar. It's not just one thing or the other thing. You're doing all three with very thoughtful intention, very strategically, and to use these levers to drive and make a difference. And I think that's what's different. Sorry for repeating that, but that's what's different in what I hear.
Yeah.
We all take on D&I or women's leadership in different ways, and often you hear either the compliance aspect or sort of sporadic pieces, or oh yes, let's just roll out, everybody gets a sponsor or something. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that it perhaps needs to be more holistic in nature, and how we collectively put these efforts together that actually has a much greater impact than if we did a pillar by itself or any one initiative by itself. Does that sound right?
Yeah, you got it. I mean, look, I sometimes I just think we overcomplicate things, and organizations are complicated, but how do you want to be treated? How do you treat people? How aware are you of how those things are all happening? And if an organization can align and focus on, again, I keep thinking, no, we take such a passive approach, generally speaking, around culture. But if that was taken as seriously as we look at our financial performance, and you really look at your workforce and figure out, what do we want of this talent? How do we empower them? What's the authentic experience we want people to have? How are we grooming leaders, people managers? All those things have such a powerful impact on how it feels to come to work. And that has such an impact on, how inspired you are and how you can really tap into the talent that your resources bring. And all of that has an impact on what you put in the market, regardless of, of your sector. I really feel like it'll be very interesting to watch, I don't know, in the next 10 years or so, how corporations show up in the face of how our society is shifting. Regardless of where you stand on all these societal changes, I think corporations, and I'm so encouraged by this, I think they're very thoughtful about really wanting to evolve in a good direction. And look, not everyone's going to get this, and it's going to happen in different waves and all that sort of stuff. But I believe if we're smarter at figuring out how do you connect some of these traditionally soft components to the bottom line, and again, metrics are huge to help with that. Those are some really big game changers, and we'll get better. I'm feeling optimistic today. I could do a whole cynical webcast as well, but let's take it in a good direction.
Let me pause you. Actually, we're almost running out of time, so I'm going to ask you a combined question from the audience, and then maybe for the control room, we'll probably skip the polling question and jump into the finishing slides into the video. But the question is, how are you educating your organization about the role of a sponsor versus the role of mentors, coaches, etc.? And it's sort of appending to that is, how are you measuring results around some of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, this is where I would go back to at the very top of the house in our firm. There's a really strong commitment to all these things. And so our D&I team sits directly at our global executive, and then they report up into our CEO. And our talent team, our HR team, has a significant role to play here. So this is to help us internally make sure, the nuts and bolts are thoughtful and deliberate. A really strong way for us to measure some of those things. We have our same annual goal setting and performance management processes as many of you guys will. So, table stakes, get it embedded in that, people accountable, earnings and, compensation, incentives. Those are really, all that stuff still matters. It still works. But, there are key milestones in our business that really have been shaped around some of, bringing some of these things to life. And that's partnership. So think of your equivalent in your organizations as I kind of describe it. But we have a very, very focused annual process for partnership, people to make partners, and it's not easy. And it shouldn't be easy, is my view on it. This is, you get equity into this firm, and then there's a very wonderful career path that sits amongst being a partner in a firm like ours. Several years ago, oh gosh, for many years now, we have been taking a very deliberate focus on how do we bring a lot of these talent strategies and concepts that we talked about today and pull them into who we determine and what it means to make a partner in our organization. And again, we're not perfect. We're getting better at this stuff, but we are learning, we're growing, but we're very clear on our own culture, which we're very, very protective of. When things are coloring outside the lines, you can see it. You can see how organizational culture can be such a powerful tool to help keep that stuff straight and narrow.
And great, thank you for that, Susan. And you know what, I was going to say, just in the interest of time, can I ask the control room to show this really cool video about belonging? And for the audience, it'll be just a little over a minute, and then we'll come back and close out the webcast. Go ahead, control room.
I'm part Cuban, part Filipino, part black, and part white. If you want to talk ethnicity with me, we might be here for a while. I'm racially ambiguous, so you always get the question like, what are you? Growing up in South Philly with two biracial parents, I was never black enough for the black people, Latino enough for the Spanish community. I pretty much didn't fit anywhere. And over time, I just adapted to be a chameleon of sorts. So race, as it relates to my own identity and journey, has always been something very complicated to navigate. To truly get to know someone that's different than you, I think people really need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I'm really proud of the people I work with every day. Not a lot of people can say that. To me, out in the world, sometimes people just can't get past those differences. You have to be willing to take a risk. That's tough for people. Here at EY, we celebrate and embrace those differences. And it changes everything.
Terrific. So what a great, snazzy little video to bring out that sense of belonging and what this represents to EY or any particular organization. So thank you, Susan, for that. I think we just have another minute or so. I wanted to first thank Susan. Thank you so much. We've got so much conversation that we really have not had enough time in this webcast, but I thank you for your thoughts, and I thank you for telling us sort of how we're going to try to make a difference and continue to push the envelope, and what does that mean for all of us if we are continuing to work in this space. Let me also invite the audience to next month's Global Leadership Forecast. As I mentioned, this is an annual 12-month series of webcasts, and next month we're taking on multi-generation or next-generation diversity. So we're going to expand upon some of the conversations that Susan and I were having today, but taking it into other aspects of what the research showed, as well as, of course, what other companies are doing in this space. And finally, if you wanted to join us at our annual Women's Leadership Conference, please do. We invite you. I attend this every year. It's often a really great agenda with terrific speakers. And please do join us if you're able to here in New York. And Susan, thank you again. Thank you.
My pleasure. This was wonderful. And thank you all for joining. Amy,
thank you.
Great job.
Thank you to the audience for all your questions. I'm Amy Abel with the Conference Board. Have a great day.